So first of all, I mean, I want to thank Smashing Boxes, definitely Ellen, Joel. I mean, it's awesome to be invited. It's awesome to talk and for sharing your space with us. It's really cool. Also, the Iron Yard for lending Clinton to talk about some closure. Is anyone who's interested in like the closure talk tonight? I mean, yeah, I think a lot of people have that like curiosity burning up. It's cool stuff. So my name is Josh Bielik. I originally was a front-end developer at a company called Fragment in Raleigh. It's a small shop with like 5 people. Took the reins of that position and loved every bit of it. We did like ad hoc client agency work, so it was build an application from scratch, start with new style sheets, and that's something that I think I'll always love. And there's a lot of meetups where you'll see people that are working at like places like Bigot who do that on such a large scale that they get so good at the iterative process, and that's what this is kind of about. Is this is not going to be probably super applicable to your small one-off that you made in Yeoman or something like that. If you have a small site and you're just doing CSS, like do whatever you got to do. I mean, this is not sort of applicable to that. I currently work at AdWorks, which is a division of Reverb Nation in Durham. We're just across the tracks over there, and so now I'm a full stack developer. I still write CSS, but not as much, so my street cred has gone down. And I want to preface this by saying, like, I don't have an agenda or a framework or something to sort of instill in you. Like, I don't have a way that I want you to write a CSS class or the name that you should give it. This is really more of like a philosophy or a challenge. Like, I want to, put some ideas in your head and ask you maybe to think about things a little bit further, and maybe avoid some of the things that we'll talk about today. So a lot of the ideas and philosophies that I'll be borrowing are from Nicole Sullivan. Nicole Sullivan originally worked at Yahoo, went on to consult for Facebook, Salesforce, Trulia, Box.net, and started her own little consulting company. Basically, she is considered like the huge CSS person or the scalable CSS like master. And I would say that if with any dogma, there are sort of the extremists, in that she might be on the side that is 100% object-oriented CSS, and we'll talk about what that might mean. So I want to kind of find a middle ground that we can all kind of benefit from. But basically, the concept is this. I don't have any. I'm not going to suggest the way to write your properties or talk about browser prefixes or anything like that, or strategies in actually styling an element. Basically, the complex part, or the part that's hard as a developer, is going to be everything outside of the curly braces. Everything about selecting elements or keeping reusable code and not being redundant, and, doing the same work more than once. So that's her quote, obviously. So, let's go backwards. So, can anyone in the room give me, don't be shy, tell me what a CSS best practice that you know of is. What best practices CSS, anybody's guess. It's pretty subjective. So, if you've heard something, you thought you heard it somewhere, we'll talk about it. Yes?
Minify it.
Yeah, okay, great. Yeah, obviously, make it small. Clients can get it faster.
Don't use inline CSS.
Yeah, that's a good one. I mean, there's probably some very clear, obvious reasons for that. Working in a large application, or, that's why style sheets were invented, right? I assume, right?
Not use too many dots going down the hierarchy.
Sure, yeah, like descendants, or, walking down too many selectors, basically. Yeah. Use classes more than IDs. Yeah, that's a common one. I hear a lot about that, and I think even a year ago maybe I read something that said, don't ever use IDs, and I was like, okay. Yeah, it's funny. Because it's like, those reasons aren't obvious. That's kind of one of those subjective ones where someone said it's really important to not use IDs, and you're like, well, why? It's kind of like fast and stuff. So, was there a hand in the back, I think?
Oh,
sorry. Yeah, okay, so I've seen the same thing written in the wild on the interwebs. So basically, when Nicole Sullivan decided to do this consulting thing, and what she was in charge of was kind of cleaning up the mess that some very large applications had made. What they did, her and a partner, was look at the Alexa top 1,000 websites and kind of rep for some common things, or see how many redundancies there might be. And I will say, there's a lot of numbers on here, and they're really high, and it sounds crazy. Given, one of these is Facebook, so how many places do you think they define a color in Facebook? It's going to be huge. So I won't say these are clearly the most obvious indicators that something is wrong in your style sheet. They're kind of extreme examples, and what she found was when they looked at the top 1,000 sites and they grepped for a font size declaration, what she's saying is you know, if you have a style guide for your website or for your brand, how many different font sizes do you think are like going to be defined? Or if you asked your designer how many ways should like a font appear, it's probably not 889, and that's not unique, but it's use whatever divisor you want. And then 78% of them had like over 10 declarations. That seems pretty fair, but it is something like notable if, you know, 22% were way over 10, or if they were close to 900 or something like that. So there's some more like examples here. I think the funniest one that she kind of mentioned was Facebook when they're looking through that. You know, Facebook is like, it's brown, or I'm sorry, it's not brown. It's blue, it's gray, and it's white, and like, it's black and stuff. But like, how many color declarations did they have in there? 6,498. So things were probably redundant in that style sheet. You can look at these stats later. There's also a link to the video at the end if you're really curious about some of those things. Like I said, they're interesting. When I say CSS specificity, does everyone in the room kind of understand that? Raise your hand if maybe you're kind of confused about how the weight or what styles win on an element. Okay, cool. Yeah, so there's some people. I didn't think about it so much. You kind of naturally move into an understanding of it, but it's most easily boiled down into this like concatenation of weights. You know, like this gets so many points and this gets so many points, and when you add them up all together, they get this sort of combined weight. It's not purely mathematical. It's not a base 10 calculation or anything. But what we can sort of break it out into is a style attribute. Like you said, you have something in the style attribute of an element. Like that's going to be 1,000 weight, super strong. So you can basically throw your style sheet away because that's probably, you know, with some exceptions, going to be the only thing that applies. So that's worth 1,000 points. That's really high. ID attributes, 100 points. So that's like the next column. Obviously, it's a super efficient way to like target a single element and know exactly what's going to get applied to that because it's super weighty. I know if you're like sat in front of it and like you're inspecting it in Firebug or Chrome Developer Tools and you're just like, I used an ID here. I'm pretty sure my style should be applied. Like, and then you're smacking yourself in the head why it's not. I've been there. Class, pseudo, and attribute selectors are weighted at 10. So things like, you know, any class that you define, attribute selectors, which are, you know, unqualified or qualified, like the one seen there, and the type and hover. And then the last column, which is 1 point, so to speak, each are element, pseudo elements. So like before pseudo elements. They're not really elements, they're just kind of rendered. As well as like descendant. You know, descendant will just add a weight of 1. So let's break down what this would actually mean if we're looking at like, you know, a line of a selector in our application. So the following line is a selector that I found in the wild existing in an application. It's real. I just changed the names to protect their identities. But let's assume on your checkout page or, you know, your funnel, you have package selection. You have 2 or 3 packages, whatever. We're going to namespace everything in the free user packages class. Maybe there's no styles applied there. I actually, if I looked back at the code, there probably aren't any specific styles to a semantic, you know, name like that. We get a row, bootstrap row. We're going to also mean that this is a unit pricing row. I don't know what that means either. Product widget with unit pricing list, an ID thrown in there. It's like, bam, blammo, we want some weight. Another unit row kind of thing, and then H1s. So all the way to an H1. Basically what we wanted is to apply styles to an H1. So if we add all this up, we've got an ID, so that's 100 points, right? 100 points on the board. We have, ding, 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 5 class or pseudo attributes, pseudo or attribute selectors, as highlighted in orange. And then on the end, an element, so that's another point. So the total for this is 151. And if anyone's not making the connection, what that means is in your style sheet, you've got maybe 7 or 8 or 900 different places that you've styled in H1. This one has a weight of 151. That's pretty weighty. You'll probably see the styles that are under that applied to the H1 on the page. And all that weight for what? Literally the only property in that little curly bracket was font weight 500. This seems like overkill. I don't know. It's anyone's game. You know, if you want to name things like that and you want to namespace and you want to do descendant selectors, but I think What I'm trying to say is that I don't think you need all that weight for, changing the font weight of your header on a certain page and things like that. And the biggest thing I can emphasize is, yes, this is subjective. There are places where it's 7 selectors deep, and there are places where it's like 2 or 3. And my point is not that 3 is okay and 4 is not. It's just, this is too many. And you should be able to identify when that happens. And I'll give you some tools about how you can sort of sense that. Also, one more thing on this slide, like more specificity, those 7 selectors does not mean it's more performant. It does not mean that you can find that element better. I think something that's like often confused is maybe the way that you write a jQuery selector. And you're thinking, well, I give it a namespace, and then it knows somewhere else to look, and then it knows an even smaller place to look, and you sort of drill down. That's not how the browser evaluates styles. And when you write it from left to right that way, we'll talk a little bit more about why that's not the way the browser wants to do that, not performant. So left to right, like I said, or top down. Basically, if I'm the person that was styling that page and wrote that style, I'm thinking, well, here's the outer container. I know the thing I want is here, and I have one container here, here, here. I want to give it context, and I want to give it location, and I want to give it, ways to find what it's looking for. So I'll just go from the top down and kind of trickle down the DOM hierarchy. What that ends up doing is giving you like an unnecessary use of descendant selectors. Those are a hot topic. Much like you don't ever use IDs, use classes only. That's a concern born of performance CSS, making things super fast, making the browser able to find the elements faster. The descendant selector is one of the most costly ways for the browser to look for something, and we'll dive deeper into how that works a little bit later. But is it necessary to have 7? Probably, in my opinion, no. So I think it's just a matter of looking at those and understanding, like, am I using too many descendant selectors? Does it need that many? Does the weight need to be that high? Preprocessor bloat. This is something I think is like really rampant, maybe, or maybe it's just something that I've seen personally a lot. But we'll go into a screenshot of what I like to call sassy pyramids, which is if you've ever heard like async pyramids or not async pyramids, but your callback pyramids like in Node where you're just nesting and nesting and nesting, and you're like, wow, this is like 9 indentations deep. Preprocessors, I think, really enable that sort of usage, and you'll see why that's kind of dangerous in the end. So overuse of inline styles. I'm guilty of this. If I'm going in and I'm doing some back-end stuff, and the page just needs to do it right, okay? What I'm going to do is right in there, I'm going to go, oh man, is anyone looking? Style attribute, font weight 500, done. Get out of here. Now I'm under my time at work, or whatever. If you do time tracking, or I don't have to worry about it. I don't have to think about the next guy who's going to do that. And what that results in is specificity wars. You're fighting other people. You're fighting other developers in the future who are going to try to make modifications to that or mix styles in. And then you've got inline styles, and you've got your 7 selectors deep, and then maybe you have the original H1 styles that are bold or whatever. And then I'm looking at it on the page thinking like, what is being applied here? Could you identify what styles are being applied without opening the developer tools? Could you do it without opening Firebug and then hitting up at the top where you have that little style attribute, sort of like hotkey place where you can just type in your own and it applies them, and they're kind of just the most weighty and stuff. That's the important part, I think. That's what we're aiming for, is just to be able to understand the context of your styles without it being location based on this page and this element under this circumstance. It's kind of, it gets crazy. And lots of importance or important tags or property declarations. Everyone's familiar with the important sort of thing. So how that applies to the whole specificity spectrum we had, it doesn't add any certain number to that. It kind of adds a second set to the left in front of it. So if you're kind of thinking about it as a number, obviously something with an important tag is going to have this whole set of way more important stuff, even if it's just an attribute or an element, So those win, unless they're overridden in the cascade. So here's a cool code example. This is a Sass style sheet. So when I started looking at Sass style sheets, I thought it's a lot of indentation. Does an indentation mean it just nests things over and over? And this is a real code snippet that lives out in the wild, just like the other one. And this is where I got the original selector that we explored the specificity with. So when this is compiled, it looks like this. It's kind of scary. It's scary to me. This is multiple. There's commas here, so don't be like alarmed at that. But that is the one that we were looking at. And I'm just very skeptical that it needed that sort of specificity. But I will say that the value of a structure like this is developer time. You know, people were aiming at making writing styles easier. So when you look at this, it kind of follows the DOM hierarchy the same way your HTML does. You know, you have the same indentations. You kind of follow a rough schematic that matches, a blueprint, so to speak. What I'm saying is not that preprocessors are terrible, don't nest things. There are recommendations. I couldn't say there are best practices because something like this works. And it's not broken. But that you should avoid that because it's not necessary. That's all it is. Like it's over specific, and you'll have trouble using that later or working on that later. So be wary. So what are the red cards? Like what are we looking at in terms of, you know, what are we going to sacrifice if we're going on the fringe of this, you know, and seeing these kinds of style sheets? Specificity overkill. Obviously, things are, you know, very drilled down, and like all the reasons we talked about, that's going to mean more time for you later, or a harder time developing, or you smacking your forehead thinking like, why is my property not being applied here? Something that you might want to look inwards or in your organization is a lack of front-end standards or practices. Like if I came to your development team and I said like, well, what is the policy? You know, like what kind of philosophy or strategy or methods do you guys use to keep things in track so that other developers can work on it? And is there a methodology here? Would you have anything to answer, or would it just be like, we all kind of just put our ideas in the same bucket? So think about that. There are methodologies out there. There are books written on several different subjects and different conflicting even ways of doing things. And there are links at the end for things like that, like semantically awesome CSS or something like that. There's an object-oriented CSS style guide. There's a GitHub style guide. Trust. One of these things that this really hits home for me if I'm sitting next to my developers and I'm thinking, well, I'm just going to put this style attribute here. Like it's easy for me. I don't really trust the styles that other guy wrote, or the guy that used to work here. He probably did a terrible job. I'm probably going to spend an hour fixing it, and when I find it, I'm going to tear it apart even more. And you're just like, I don't trust the way someone else did it. I'm going to do it my own way, and I'm going to attack this. And then you're sort of, everyone's attacking in a different way maybe, and you have conflicting methodologies and ways that you're trying to work on and maintain this huge living document inside of your application. So. Redundancy and time costs. And I just included this tiny little quote that I really like by Eric Raymond, who wrote The Art of Unix Programming. This is one of the 17 Unix rules. Developers should value developer time over machine time. And how much do computer cycles cost today? You know, some people would argue that we don't need to worry about how bloated our style sheets are. We're gzipping them and they're minified. Bandwidth is easy. But, I mean, we could say that all day long about a lot of things, but the point is it's always a concern, and it's always something that you should think about, and the reasons we think about that are for the greater good and for our client, our user base having a better experience. And this is the same sort of way, but it has the added benefits that you as a developer of your company can better achieve or better do your job. So reduced cost, basically. If you get on the same page and you're using some framework and modules and object-oriented CSS, are you really going to spend as much time doing it? I would argue no. And style sheets as living documents. If you had a style guide for your company, is it going to change? Probably not. But the point is that all of the places that style guide, the text sizes, the font weights, the fonts themselves, the colors, all the places that's not going to change are the places that are going to change. You're going to delete them tomorrow, or there's going to be a new page, or you're going to have a new design, or you just did it and there's a new alteration to the design that you need to make. So the point is, be nice to yourself, give yourself the opportunity to easily pick out parts and change things without giving yourself a headache. And then bloat, if you write easily 9 indentations of nested CSS and you compile that, you're going to have this enormous style sheet that you might never realize because you don't really touch it at all. So how do we move forward? Like, what are the ways we can sort of think about this and combat it and better the things that we write or think about it? Separation of concerns. I mean, in a programming sense, I'm sure you've heard this. You know, you want to separate what one sort of module or object or method or function knows about the grand scheme of things and what it knows about other modules and objects. And I think a pattern that you'll see that's very object-oriented CSS and things like Bootstrap and Foundation and sort of the libraries that we depend on to get us up and running for, you know, from small applications to even large ones that we want to use that, is separating the concerns of things, like separating what is the structural kind of elements and the structural kind of helpers that we have in utility classes from what we apply colors to and what we sort of apply as the paint or the decoration or the chrome to something. So I'm not saying you only go on one side and you only make styles that are colors and you only make styles that are structures. But I think the migration towards that is what helps us sort of make this separation of concerns and have modular styles that we can apply elsewhere and build fast, you know? I don't want to start a new page and spend all day rebuilding the grid or defining how I'm going to make a little well with text in it. So very along that same vein, break code into the smallest possible pieces. And this is another like Unix rule, which, you know, you could argue it applies a lot more to programming than it does to like style sheets, but you know, I like to think about it that way, and I don't mean, again, to be extreme about this. Don't break out everything into like font size, you know, 2.1 rems, and that's my class is like font size 2.1 rems. Like it would be a little bit crazy if you went that far, but as much as possible, you know, make things into modules, break it up, and define places that you can reuse stuff. So, and a bottom-up, right-to-left strategy. This is, I think, one of the. It took me a while to sort of break that into like a way to describe how, you know, the top-down thing works with the bottom-up. And I think this is like a really great strategy when you're sitting on your page and you just develop the element, you need to style it, and you're looking at it and you're like, well, how will I target this element? Like, you know, you've written so many styles, you know, I need sort of this much weight to get to this. I need this many classes or something. And when we have the 7 styles broken down, it's easy to go from the top down and be like, well, it's in this namespace and it's that. What I'm saying is go bottom up. Like if you have an element on the page, you're like, how can I get it to be X or Y property? Look at that. See how few selectors you can use to get to that. I mean, it makes sense to, regardless of components and you know, having tabs that have tab ULs or whatever, use as few as possible and see if you can target that element with like 2 or 3, and then go as deep as you need to, I guess. But you kind of reverse the whole drilling strategy, which is, I think, resultant of a lot of waste and descendant selectors. And then extend objects. One of the really cool parts of Sass, less things like that, CSS precompilers is like mix-ins, right? Like we can extend a button and put more stuff on the button with like include, you know, like there's easy ways to have basically objects and sort of like classes that we can subclass in CSS. And that's great in, you know, in a precompiled environment, but it's also possible with multiple classes, and it's also possible to, you know, add things and add color and structure to the same item and sort of build this, you know, this combination of that. So, and sensible semantics. The reason I wanted to preface this and say, like, I'm not trying to get you to write a class a certain way. I don't have any suggestions for how you should name it. I think when we sit down, it's our decision of like how to write this, and it doesn't come from something that we already should know. If it's not in Bootstrap, it's not in Foundation, we're doing it ourselves. It's the point where you have to make you have to carve out time to think about, you know, what am I gonna name this? So my argument is, you know, you don't have to throw semantics out the window. That's something that object-oriented CSS is kind of heavy on. Is we don't need things to be named semantically. I would say there's a middle ground, and that's something that you can decide yourself. And if you want to name something, you know, the product price package tiny well, do it. But don't do it with 7 selectors. So I put some quotes up here regarding like the CSS stuff. If you look in like the GitHub CSS style guide, it's like, as a rule of thumb, avoid nesting more than 3 indentations. 9, you're crazy. But the point is, like, if you find yourself doing that, all of us as developers, like, it's our job, if you're working in style sheets, to do that and to write these and do it intelligently. And as much as we try, like, and as diligent as you are, like, it's going to be work. It's going to be hard. I mean, that's why it's so frustrating, and that's why there's so many methodologies and ways to do it. And that's why things like Bootstrap and Foundation they just work. People want it. Just don't let me deal with that, because it's already been done. I'm reinventing the wheel. So take a step back. Spend some time thinking. Like, give it more thought than you might have, previously.
Josh,
Yes.
are there any refactoring tools that would help you in that process?
So when I was kind of putting these slides together and looking at, like, Nicole Sullivan's, grepping for stuff, I thought it was really interesting that, like, I don't know of a tool that can grep your style sheets and find redundancies. Like, I don't know that there is a tool outside of, your Uglify kind of tool for CSS, or your minifier or concatenator or whatever. I mean, we have less, right? And that's to not be redundant and to keep things really organized. But I don't know that there's a tool for that, to identify the weaknesses or the points that you could improve or not repeat yourself and things like that. Because that's what we end up with, is like really huge. We don't know how to deal with that. The next one is, like, from the Mozilla Web Guide, writing efficient CSS. I think there's maybe some exceptions, but when we were talking about the top-down strategy, and I said, well, browsers don't really do it that way. There might be an exception to this, but as far as I know, your modern browsers evaluate the selector string from right to left.